Welcome to all of you to this, our fourth lecture in the Mervyn Smith Memorial Lecture Series. Over the past 3 weeks, Dovid Katz has certainly taken us on a wonderful journey and expanded our knowledge on Jewish Lithuania. Each week, we have learned more and more, and so too have more people registered to join our webinar series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Heather Blumenthal, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. Education for the late Mervyn Smith was extremely important. We saw this through his commitment to supporting top-class educational programming at the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, and over the years, his children have continued his legacy by previously sponsoring the Mervyn Smith Memorial Lecture, and now this, our 5-part Mervyn Smith Memorial Lecture Series. We thank the Smith family for their generosity and ongoing support. It is my pleasure to introduce Dovid Katz, a world-renowned scholar of Yiddish and the Lithuanian Jewish experience. The subject of tonight's lecture is my 30 years on the road looking for the Litvaks in their native lands. To really understand a culture and to explore the nuances of a language, one has to go back to the source. I would think that when Dovid visited Lithuania for the first time, he never imagined that this would become a journey of 30 years duration. As a filmmaker myself, I know only too well that once something piques your interest, the need to explore and know more becomes foremost in one's mind and passion takes over. I'm sure that the same applies to Dovid during the course of his 30-year learning adventure. Before I hand over to Dovid, a few housekeeping rules. Unfortunately, for those of us living in certain areas in Cape Town, there is a very strong chance that we will have load shedding and will miss a large portion of Dovid's talk. Don't worry, we are recording and the lecture will be emailed to you tomorrow. Having said that, Linda may not be able to moderate your questions, in which case I will stand in for her. And if for some reason I lose Wi-Fi, Ayal Belling in Germany will take over the moderation. For the duration of the talk, all cameras and audio will be switched off. For ease of identifying all of your questions, please will you type your questions in the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your screen. The chat function will also be open to share where you come from and any comments that you may have. Should anybody wish to ask Dovid a question at the end of the session, you can put up your hand and we will open up your camera and audio. And now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dovid Katz.
Good evening. I hope everyone can see and hear. I say good evening and as relevant, good afternoon, good morning, and in some remote corners, good night. It's an honor for me to be doing the Mervyn Smith lectures, and this is the 4th of 5. I usually don't talk about my adventures and misadventures in life unless I'm allowed previously to talk about Litvaks, Yiddish, and the Lithuanian Holocaust. Well, all 3 conditions have been fulfilled in the previous 3 weeks, so today I'll have a go, and thanks to Heather for perhaps summarizing the moral of my story better than I ever could. You think you're going on a trip for a few weeks, and then it's 30 years of your life before you turn around. Well, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, as some of you may hear. My late father was Litvak Katz, a Yiddish poet, born in the Vilna area. He was 50 years old when I was born in 1956. He was born in 1906. My Brooklyn-born mother was one heck of a lot younger, and she had to put up with both of us. My father was a Yiddish poet who became an English poet as well, and in his lifetime published 18 books of poetry, 9 in Yiddish, 9 in English. The one recurring topic was his shtetl, the shtetl of where he grew up, as it happens, not exactly where he was born, but where our forefathers and foremothers lived for 600 years, Michalishik, about 40 miles from Vilna, today in Belarus. Now, growing up in the 1960s in Brooklyn, New York, a very gray, dull part of the world with no trees and a lot of American hustle and bustle, my father created for me the mystical world of his shtetl. And unlike most Yiddish writers, he insisted on speaking to me only in Yiddish. So I grew up as a Yiddish speaker. We were a secular Jewish family, but traditional. And when we go to shul, it has to be an Orthodox shul. And when it came to education, the Yiddish schools were so weak in New York, afternoon and evening only, that my parents decided on an Orthodox Jewish boys' school, yeshiva, and later yeshiva of Flatbush, mixed co-ed, but still Orthodox. So these were the inconsistencies and disconnects in life, which made for more fun. And throughout the 80s, when I had moved to Oxford and was teaching, my academic field had become Yiddish dialectology. I had been the first major in Yiddish doing my BA at Columbia University. And I remember the only time in my life I felt that feeling of burning envy, of jealousy, when my fellow students in linguistics who were studying the dialects of French or Spanish or German, they would go in the summer to the mountains to find 90-year-olds and interview them and discover new forms of forgotten and unknown dialects of the languages they were studying. My field was Yiddish dialectology. And we knew very well that there was a Holocaust that destroyed virtually everything and everyone, and that after the Holocaust came the Soviet Union that culturally destroyed what tiny remnant was left. Nevertheless, throughout the 80s, I was trying to go for my trip as people go for their parents on a roots trip with no academic or personal expectations. Incidentally, many people of East European Jewish origin have stories in the family that we come from famous rabbis or scholars or revolutionary socialists or Zionists or industrialists who invented something. Not in my family. We came from poor people in the timber business, although there was always debate about whether my father and his brother's grandfather had been rich before World War I. You only had to touch that subject and there'd be a massive fight at the Passover table. But we always knew the story of why my generation even came into existence. The first of the immediate family to emigrate was my great uncle Bentke, who was kicked out of the shtetl for his dirty tricks. If you're interested, ask me in the questions and I'll tell you exactly what got him kicked out. Then the next one went to him, the next one to him, and so forth until the family had largely emigrated by the 1920s, largely and not completely. Most of those who stayed, of course, did not survive. Well, in 1990, for the first time, the Soviet Union was already collapsing, the Gorbachev years. I got a visa, and I even had an academic reason. I said that Oxford University wants to establish contacts with Vilnius University. And by then it was much easier to go, and I went on my first trip for my father, really, to see what one could find of anything that he had mentioned in his 18 books. My late friend Harry Shukman, professor of history at Oxford, had warned me there'd be nothing left and I shouldn't expect anything. Perhaps that helped enormously to feel that the cup was really full, not empty, when I discovered much more than I thought. Now, I'm now going to move to the PowerPoint, and those of you who know me know I'm a technical dinosaur, so there'll be some fumbling, but with the help of our colleagues, I think we'll get there. I'm going to share screen, go to today's PowerPoint, and see if it works. We want to go to slideshow and from beginning. Do you see it? Is it working?
All good.
Working, Dovid.
All good.
All good. If something's not good, please yell out immediately. Okay, so today is the fourth in the fifth in the series of 5. In case you didn't come to the previous ones, I just wanted to say that you're welcome to send questions before the 5th and final webinar, meaning next Tuesday, and we will deal with them. So don't worry if you don't get your question in today or if something is left from any of the previous 4. This is my father in his late years. He's holding the mandolin there, playing folk songs of his shtetl Mechalashik. And when I went in 1990, I immediately went to the synagogue, hired a driver, and the driver took me to the one Jew he knew of in the area, Ziske Shapiro, the barber in the shtetl of Podbrudge, today Pabrade. Well, Ziske had never met a Jew coming from another country to Lithuania in the years since the war, and this was December 1990. He quickly closed the barber shop and became my translator scout for that trip and for many more till he passed away 13 years later in 2003. A whole bunch of searches led me to the one Jewish man born in Mechalashik, but he had already been in Minsk on his way to Romania to go to Israel. And I was told it would cost a fortune to convince him to come back and postpone his immigration. That fortune ended up being $21, but it was Christmas Day, and we found a driver, Pyotr Ivanov, who is still a very close friend and has been the commandeer, as we called him, of our expeditions throughout Belarus and Latvia. Because Pyotr is of the old believer Russian Orthodox faith, his Christmas is later, so we were able to go on Christmas. And this is the late Litvak Katz, no relation, the last Jew who knew everything in the nearby town of Svincian and became part of our team. So I quickly put together our little team. This is our first day in Mechalashik. Well, Mechalashik I had heard about my entire life. I have to tell the truth. This was much more exciting, may she forgive me, than meeting the Queen of England a year before in the context of Oxford University. This was meeting the mayor of Mechalashik. You can see him in the center there welcoming us. It was the first time a foreigner had visited Mechalashik during his tenure. The guy at the left is me when I looked like a boring white middle-aged male. Next to me, Ziske Shapiro, and then the mayor. Okay. The man we brought back from Minsk is here wearing the fur hat on your right, Avrem Keren. So he was the one person alive, and to my shock, he had his versions of all the stories in my father's books, like our cousin Yankele having been murdered by another Jewish fellow over a girl in 1918. He showed us every spot of the dastardly plot and how the murderer escaped across the river to become a heart surgeon in California, and that's me at the left. Well, I was able to bring back a video to my father. I was able, on the academic level, to set up a joint program of Vilnius and Oxford universities that led to many things over the years. And during my father's last 6 months, he enjoyed a video of this trip that's now on my YouTube video. After his death, I continued to try to put together more for an eventual English edition of all his works that came out in 2005. But in 1991, after he had died, I was starting from the beginning. This is a title page of one of my father's books from 1939, Sehodozvok mein Pobemoine. My grandmother Moine takes the floor. This is a reply to the communist Yiddish critics in New York who had brutally trashed his previous book, Burning Village, considering it to be sentimentalist and religious and clericalist and without socialist realism. And I remember as a little boy when I asked him, did you answer? My father said, of course not. My grandmother Moine, for whom I was named, they couldn't name a boy Moine, so I became Menke, answered in my dreams, and I published the poems she told me. So I decided, sounds a bit eccentric, but I'm here to tell you the, what's the word? The truth, the spin-free truth today. In May 1992, I brought together my expeditionary team of Ziske Shapiro, Piotr Ivanov, and we set out to the cemetery in nearby Svir to spend a month searching for the grave of this grandmother Moine. Like many cemeteries, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of stones, but scattered in the forest, half buried. And I thought that giving it a month and meanwhile making a catalog of whatever stones we could find and photographing them would be interesting anyway. To make a long story short, Piotr, Ziska, and I found her grave in 1 hour. You see here it says Moine Bast Zvi, and she died in 1900. And they were going to name the first girl after her, but they kept having boys. So 6 years after her death, when my father was born, they said, we're not going to wait anymore. We're going to name this boy Menke for Moine. So I found what I was looking for in an hour with my two colleagues. And well, I don't know why, but on intuition, I gave up at the moment the plan of spending the month at the cemetery, and we decided to drive around Belarus, asking in town squares, are there any elderly Jews alive? And so this was the free month in May 1992. The first town we came to, Smargon, which I knew from Yiddish literature as the place where the great Yiddish poet Moshe Kulbach was born. We finally came to the oldest Jewish person alive in Smargon at the time, Elke Zirulnik, sitting in front of her wooden cabin, sitting on the prisbe. That's a semi-mud, semi-wood, semi-straw, I don't know what the word is, bench outside that little house. Her Yiddish amazed me, a shtetl Yiddish of 100 years ago that I'd never heard in New York. So I think it was at that moment that at least the next 15 years was decided that there are Mohicans, as we began to call them, and we traveled a little further to Oshmane, and we came across this lovely lady, Belke Dillon, from the old Sephardic family de Leon, that became Dillon among Ashkenazim. An amazing woman who had a huge knowledge also of Torah and Talmud from her late father. I also was discovering that these Holocaust survivors had for the most part never been in a ghetto or in German-held territory for any length of time. They are the flight survivors. They are alive because in that week of June 22nd, 23rd, 1941, they fled to Russia and came back after the war and found everybody murdered and decided to stay. So this was Belke in Oshmane. In Radashkovitz, we found the only elderly Jew in town to be deeply religious, singing prayers in his garden at the cemetery all day. And he had I would call it a healthy obsession to find his father's grave. His father died before the war. And in later years, we spent a week with him and we found him. And we have a bit of video with him a little later. when we asked all these people, would you want to emigrate? They said, no, everybody we know among Jews emigrated. We are going to die here with our people. For them, okay, that's him again praying, or that's two of him, one playing with his goats and the other one praying. Now, interesting, we found religious and anti-religious. We never found anything in the middle. This was Liba Krenitsky in Mir. Some of you may have heard of Mir, a famous yeshiva town. But Liba was an old communist, and she didn't flee to Russia. She just fled to the forest to join the partisans, and has a jacket full of medals for her bravery fighting the Nazis. Liba had many off-color stories about her friendships with yeshiva students from France and Germany who had come to Mir to study in the famous yeshiva before the war, when it was, of course, Poland. When we found this in her backyard, it's a gravestone to a Jewish woman called Gittel. We said to her, what is this? And she said, well, I found it somewhere. I want to live as a communist, but die as a Jew. So my neighbors know to put this on my grave when I die. And I said, but it says Gittel, and you are Liebe bis 120, may you live till 120. And then Liebe started making fun of us silly foreigners who understand nothing. Who cares here whether it's Gitte or Liebe or Mira or anything else? No one will read it. It's a Jewish gravestone. Going back for a moment to her. Liebe was tragically murdered in a very brutal murder in the autumn of 1999, a few years after she was brought to London to testify in a war crimes trial. And it may be that that had something to do with her murder, never been investigated. This is in Lithuania, not in Belarus, in the town of Utena or Utena. And this was a very Catholic household with Christian and Catholic symbols everywhere. And a lady at the church, in return for a dollar bill, it had to be a brand new dollar. She wanted a beautiful dollar over $5 that had some damage on it, said she would tell us about the one Jew in town who was saved by the priest in her native nearby town during the Holocaust, and thinks that nobody knows that she was Jewish, and she's now married to her second Catholic husband, who certainly doesn't know. Well, I had a few experiences of having the door closed on my hand and so forth, so I expected the worst, but Ziske translated, he eased the way in. Piotr gave her many compliments, and she spoke in Lithuanian for half an hour, apologizing that she had forgotten Yiddish, and then something snapped. And for the first time since June 1941, she started to speak in the most pure, beautiful, untouched Yiddish of pre-World War II, of her nearby shtetl Abolnik, Vabolnik. In the Holocaust literature, there's the story about the priest who tried to save several dozen Jews in Abolnik by converting them to Catholicism, but the Nazis and their local collaborators murdered them all anyway, 5 minutes later at the same mass grave site. And some history books say there were no survivors, but Fegichke Yoffe explained to us that the priest actually did save her alone. And she's was a very devout Christian. That's her in her yard. This is another woman saved by the local priest, Litvak Katz in Vorne, and she comes up in Heschel's Kingdom and several other fine books that were written. She was one of the last Jews, she and her sister, in Vorne. And she wanted to reconvert to Judaism for years, but the rabbis in Vilnius were too busy fighting with each other to have time to go all the way out west to help her. So that was that. Okay, sometimes we found more than one residual Jewish culture in a town. This is Drisa, which is now Verkhny Dvinsk. Khrushchev changed the name from Drisa because Drisa has some sounds very similar to a not nice word in Russian and in the local Yiddish. Anyhow, Hirsch and Pinyan were the two last Yiddish-speaking Jews in town who fought all day but couldn't live without each other. When they passed away, it was within a week of each other. They fought as usual about God and religion. Hirsch at the left was a communist and atheist, and Pinyan at the right wanted to recover as much as he could of the Jewish religion. And this was such a primitive scene that there was no bridge to their town. You had to take the ferry, the parom. So this is them saying goodbye as we leave on the ferry. This is in the town of Disna. And in Yiddish literature, Disna is very famous because the poet Mesha Kulbach, aforementioned, who had was born in Smargon, lived in Vilna, later in Minsk, he wrote the Yiddish classic Child Harold of Disna. And in Disna, that's Ziske Shapiro, the former barber and now translator and scout on the left. Those are the Sverdlovs, okay, Schiffer and Mendel, the couple that we found. And we were lucky to be accompanied by the Belarusian scholar of Yiddish, Vital Zaika, on the right. Hope he's listening tonight. He's now a major scholar of Belarusian Yiddish in New York. Actually, he speaks Yiddish so well. He studied Yiddish with us at Oxford, so of course he speaks Yiddish so well, that Mrs. Sverdlov wanted him for a son-in-law for her absent daughter who lived in Latvia. And Vital kept saying to her, "Ich bin a Shegetz, ich bin a Goy. Will doch nicht, dass Tochter soll Chasdov mit a Goy. I'm a non-Jew. I'm a Goy. You don't want your daughter to marry a Goy." And then Shifra would burst out laughing with such a Yiddish, he wants me to think he's a Goy. Oi, my daughter will love his sense of humor. Well, Vital managed to escape the daughter, but we had many adventures on the road. This is the couple, Shifra and Mendel. I'm afraid their story had a very tragic ending. Mendel wanted to move to Israel. Shifra didn't. When he finally insisted, she took her own life. She hanged herself in the barn with instructions to bury her at the mass grave where her mother was buried. So this was a very, very sad ending to the story. Well, in the town of Smolovich, okay, that's a little bit north of Minsk, not to be confused with Smilovich, we met Yankiv, who was 100 years old, and his wife of just 88, Peshke Levitan. Okay, he was Yankiv Freiman. Now, they fought day and night over religion. He had been a lifelong socialist and communist, and she spent her days at her pious grandmother's grave in the forest in Smilovich. This is a town near Polotsk in the north. What you see in the back is the remnant of a wall from the 1950s, a garden wall, to hide what had been a secret synagogue in the worst Stalin years of the late 40s and the early 50s. There were hundreds of these in Belarus. They were not called a klois or a shul or a bismedrish, any of the traditional words for a house of prayer. They had a special Yiddish word, davenstu. That's the house where you pray. Daven. Okay. Now, this fellow sitting here, I don't think ever prayed. It was his father and his father's generation who had prayed behind that gate. Oops. Okay, and that's he's Lezaker, and that's his sister Merke. So they showed us the locked up cupboard disguised as a clothing cupboard with suits in front and the books for praying hidden in the back. We eventually purchased them, and now they're part of our exhibition in Vilnius, God willing, when you come to visit as soon as present problems are over. This is typical. This is the Jewish wedding ceremony, a page fixed up with Scotch tape many times, and it's bound in a book cover that says Stalin, okay? So most of these books were bound in Soviet book covers that said Stalin or Lenin. So at least if someone happened to see them without opening them, they wouldn't be in trouble. Okay, so that's Polotsk, near Polotsk actually, Kabik. Today it's part of Polotsk, but it was once a separate shtetl across the river. In Radin, famous for the great Rabbi Chofetz Chaim, we began to visit Meir Kistola. This was not all in that first trip. The first 3 were from that trip. I'm now taking us into many of our return trips. Twice a year from Oxford, I would do these expeditions for several weeks at a time, collecting audio and later video recordings of the last Litvak Yiddish. So this Meir Kistola in Radin, you can see he's missing his right hand. He was a partisan in the forests of Radin, and a very famous story. When the Jews were asked to dig their own graves, he was one of the healthy young men selected. And saying, there's no way I'm going to dig my own grave, he hit the German guard over the head with the shovel, fled into the forest, and made it, and became the founder of the partisan group. He survived the war intact, but lost his hand to a Soviet machine in a factory after the war. So Meir Kistola of Radin, an amazing character who, by the time of his death in the late 90s, was visited by a number of famous historians who wanted his testimony. Okay, Shimke Zhulik. Now, Yiddish nicknames can be brutal. Zhulik is sort of like a faker or a shyster, and long after Yiddish stopped to be the language of Tvincian, Trentionis, 90 kilometers north of Vilna, all the non-Jews called him Shimke Zhulik because they knew that that was his name, a wagoner, a balagola, here taking us to Vilna to show us the favorite brothel, may he forgive me, of the wagoners, of the balagolas, when they would bring merchandise to Vilna. And this is another great hero of World War II, my late dear friend Melech Stalevich. He came back after the war to Vilna to say goodbye. He didn't want to stay in a town where all his relatives were murdered. This was 1946, I think. As he was leaving, right near the train station, a Polish owner of a kiosk that sells newspapers and had some kind of cinema recognized him from before the war and said, "Hey, your mother survived." Melech got very angry, stopped making fun of me, and the Polish guy closed his shop and said, "Come, let's find her." And this is the spot where he found his mother and where he lived the rest of his life till his death several years ago. His mother died in the late 70s, I think, or early 80s. Melech Stalevich, an amazing personality of old Jewish Vilna. What we often did, especially in Lithuania, where not many Jews of a shtetl wanted to return to the shtetl after the war, they moved to Kovna, or in most cases, Vilnius, Soviet Vilnius. So we would take them, we did this in Belarus and Latvia too. We would take them, Piotr would drive them, our team would take them to their pre-war shtetl for the day, okay? So this is the late Dobke Yonis, an amazing woman. She was born in 1913 and died at the age of 101 and had all her faculties with her till the end. That's a dreidel she made herself by hand in the Stalin years when you couldn't buy a dreidel. And that's Dobke when we took her back to her native Zhezhma, to the wooden synagogue, which she, in her 90s, she began to draw and paint from memory every part of Jewish Zhezhma from before the war. Hirschpekel was in Vilna known as the Mohican of Vilkomir or Ukmerge, and this is the day we took him back to his native Vilkomir. Here we had a very sad scene where he's trying to enter what had once been his grandparents' place, and the people who lived there didn't trust him or us to come in. I expect he would have done better without us there. Now, there are some academic projects here. The main academic project is an atlas of Lithuanian Yiddish. I know that dialectology is not everybody's cup of tea, so we're going to just run through this to give a feel of what it's all about rather than take the time. All of this is on the web, on my website under Atlas. First, we made a border around the territory that we are researching, Lithuania, okay? And then we would start asking, how do you say this? How do you say that? So famous words like potato, is it kartoshke, is it bulbe, or is it bulve? Divided the Litvaks into Western and Eastern and Central Litvaks. And here are all the forms we found that are listed on the map. This ends up being important for other things. If 10 different words end up having boundaries that match cultural boundaries that are not linguistic, we're able to begin to reconfigure the types of Litvak geographically. In the case of the word for face, ponim, well, we found that in many areas of Litvish Yiddish, the word wasn't ponim, it was tsure, or lovingly tsurke. Oi, what a nice tsurke she has in men's language. But in other areas, tsurke, tsure, or tsurke were derogatory and insulting, and ponim was the nice word. So again, we see that the division is into a north and a south. It's not random, okay? Among Litvaks, the most famous is perhaps the word for ear, what you hear with. That in Zamet, in the far west of Lithuania, in places like Salant, it was Ur, in Kovna, Eyer, in Vilna, Ever, in Minsk, Ever, and so forth. So how you say ear. Again, this ended up matching with other cultural configurations. Many Eastern Litvaks didn't say homentashin, they said hometes or homentes, okay? We're going to, a special island of a mixed dialect is around Chernobyl, where it's mostly Litvish Yiddish, but one vowel, ui, is pronounced as in Ukraine. And that had become the classic Yiddish of the Chernobyl Hasidim, who were one of the northern, the Lithuanian, northeastern Lithuanian groups of Hasidim. Of course, they didn't let us into Chernobyl for reasons you know better than me, but we found Jews from Chernobyl who had been resettled after the 1986 accident and were living only several miles from Chernobyl. Often one person with a good linguistic memory can tell us about a whole border between Litvish and non-Litvish on the Litvish-Ukrainian border. So again, I won't go into the details, but to show you the kind of thing. Turning to Western Lithuanian, Zamet, we were lucky to find Fredke Niegnevitsky from the shtetl of Kule. I don't know if anybody listening perhaps has ancestors in Kule, who remembered the 13 towns that still spoke in the exotic dialect of Zamet, Žemaitija, Samogishia on the eve of World War II. Okay. Then the name of the territory, the further east you go, the more often it was called Reisen rather than Lita, but that meant Lita in the narrow sense. Lita in the larger sense continued to be all of it. Okay, so these are simply maps, results. As I mentioned, we found that those who are not religious tend to be very atheist. Those who are profoundly religious tend to be much more believers than we are. There was widespread poverty, many pro-Soviet feelings for the Soviets, not the Soviet Union per se, and certainly not Stalinism, but the memory, the collective memory of the Soviets having driven out the Nazis from all these countries. And in many cases, these survivors became soldiers. For example, in Lithuania proper, they would have been from the 16th Division. And finally, I mentioned many are flight survivors who didn't live in ghettos, who fled to the Soviet Union, and many have an obligation to stay. Okay. This is a map of the different areas that they themselves use. For example, I mentioned Zamet in the west, that'd be Kurland in the northwest, Polesye in the southwest, Reisen in the east, and so forth. I'm going to skip some of the academic parts. We can come back to them. Interesting, sometimes borders that didn't exist since 1939 were very important. You see the border between the pink and the yellow on this map. This is an interwar map. In the 1930s, the huge Poland is the pink, and the yellow in the right to the east is the Soviet Union. Today, that border is smack in the middle of Belarus. It's no border. But once we learn that people from the west of that border are likely to know 10 times more of traditional Jewish religious background, language, and indeed literature than people from the east who went to the Soviet Yiddish school, we realized that that border was still very much alive, not only in the differences in language and culture, but in the consciousness of the people themselves. So both groups live in what is today Belarus, or in Yiddish, Weißrussland, but each called the other one Yene Weißrussland, the other Weißrussland, the other Belarus, not the real one. So to take two towns very close to each other, let's say Slutsk and Kletsk, that Slutsk was on the Soviet side and Kletsk on the Polish side. And indeed, that's how the Slutsk yeshiva was saved when its incredible rabbi took it across the border after World War I to become the Kletsk yeshiva. That's with today's boundaries superimposed. Okay, questions are now welcome, but I'm wondering, first of all, let's try to make contact again and see how we're doing with time, and to ask Heather, who is happily still with us and who has defeated all blackouts in Cape Town, whether we have time to show some snippets of a video of some of these people, or whether we should go to questions and save the video for later or next week. I'll leave it to Heather, who has a better idea than me of what has accumulated in the way of questions.
Okay, so we do have some questions, but we have had somebody from your friend Smida, I think she's in Los Angeles, California. She said, could we please watch the video now and then do the questions and answers afterwards? So I'm happy for you to do the video. I think we'll enjoy it, and then we'll go.
Sure. Let's make an attempt to do parts of this. This is simply a compilation. Now, a confession. I didn't use video in the early years. Everything was on the old audio cassettes. So these videos are from return trips in the late 1990s. And this anthology is from the work of my good friend, the Lithuanian videographer, Saulius Beržinis. Okay, so let me see if I am able to But before we go further, is it working, Heather?
Absolutely perfect. We can hear it.
Haben wir gedacht, Wasser haben, vielleicht auf 5 Lunken vergessen, mit der Kalibatsch geht die umgesetzt. Вот такие. И тут еще вот это заливаемся. Все вместе. Ой! Ай, капсуля, капсуля! Дома. Нет. Все. Ага. Аргесница.
An was Nikolai in der Rogeneme?
Nee.
Was denn Zugeneme in Talet bei Nacht?
Wer mit?
Und wir haben geschlafen, die Soldaten. Aber wir nicht gewusst, was bei Nacht hat er getan. Und die Offiziere haben es gewusst. Und die Kollegen mit gesagt. Also Nikolai aus der Rogeneme, mit seine Foto mit ihm. Haben sie gesagt, wir haben sein Foto in Talet. Und wir sind nu gestanden für Schlaf wieder frei. Und wir gehen in Talet und dort ist sein Foto. Sie sind alle geworden zu Tumult. Er wird gekannt Doktor mit der Zuschüssen alle mehr. Wieder gemäht mit Kalaien und mit dem Talet weggetragen. Was nicht zu sagen, der Gerät wird gekannt Doktor.
Wer ist der gewesen?
Ach, ob ich schreiben? Ja. Ich bin ein Ruf. Ich bin ein Lehrer. Nur die Yeshiva Treckermann mit der Yeshiva. Da, in Radon. Und er ist doppelt und da begraben. Da. Ich bin da wieder mal gekommen, ich bin ein Stiebele. Und eine ewige Feier gewesen. Und noch einmal gekommen mit Salsa. Bei Neid mit Salsa weggestellt.
Was gedenkt ihr von der Feier?
Nur wovon wir gesagt wird, was jemand als Schmied und er ist auch. Andere Menschen.
Und das?
Ah? Ein kleiner, ja. Da Berdele hier. Was man ungeklebt mit starke, junge Iden und mit der weit Bank streiten auf dem Ort. Wo wir gewählt haben, eine Gruppe und mit geschossen. Wir gewählt schießen. Und nachher hat man verschießen. Und ich habe gesagt, ich war sehr grob. Ich begrabe nicht. Sollen Sie mir begraben oder ich ja sie. Nur die waren antlaufen. Doch sie haben gemacht, angenehm mit der Deis.
Wer seid ihr antlaufen?
Wir haben den Polizei mit einem Rädel im Kopf und allein im Wald. Der Wald, ich bin 8 Kilometer.
Wo in Jena sein?
Dort, so weiß. 1 Kilometer oder mehr. Und er sagt mir, als Gendarm hat mir gejuckt, auf dem Pferd. No, ich habe leben. Ich habe gesehen, am Mensch darf leben. Ich war geboren. Da war leben. Und der Faschist soll mir angehen. Oder ich hem oder mir. No, ich bin nicht ein Gesetz, wo ich gehe, oder versichert. Und ich habe Steiner, ja, und ich will bleiben. Und ich so, bleib ich. Kleb. Und alle Menschen sehen mir kleb. Und wir, das ist mein Sache, wie ich kleb. Ich bewollt, dass ich wie kleb. Kommt zuvor. Ich will leben, ich halte bei Weiden, ich halte. sagen.
Заходите. Заходите, заходите. Шихаганы погода. Здравствуйте. Заходите. Ну, заходите. Ну, met geleefd дружно. Дружно geleefd, дружно. Mit Feuer, mit nichts. Mein Leben ist doch sehr schwer. Ich bin nicht gesund und ermüdend. Tina tut sich zu mir nicht. Tina darf mir nicht. Ganoven kruгом. Nicht zerbrochen das Stahl, wie wenn er sagt, цветной Metall und zusammen und nicht erlebe ich und trage meine Nacht. Ich soll nicht umfahren, die Tür nicht zu brechen. Die Sätze also bringen Schere, Papierosen. Ich habe schwer erlebt. Alle willen gammeln, die naar nog niet gaan. Ja, wat gaat. Накладет эти свои помоды, яшки. Подошли kommen die Jiden, die Schreinen, und wir verdammen, alle Jantevin verdammen. Der Schule unserer gewinnt ruiniert, der Schule gewesen, ich gewinnt als Achiden, und dort haben die gemacht Kachel in Schule, und die Schule gewinnt in ganz Nacht zum Ruinierte. Ich wollte kommen zu uns, und bei uns von seinen Armenien, und wir verdammen. Und wir kommen, ihr wisst doch, also die Babes, sie kommen, die Женщины, wählen sie. Und die Mужчины sind nicht erkennen, sie wählen nicht nur seine Haben geschehen. Nur, wenn man gedacht hat, das ist mein älter Sohn. Hat gewesen in Hockey.
Wie Deutsch?
Sport.
Ah,
in Leningrad.
Ich verstehe, ja.
Hat mir ihm gegeben. Du ist fahren, umgeschrieben. Mir sehr gut umgeschrieben. Ein Pодарок.
То не сквацели, он то шугнуло. И вокруг гений Он уже geschossen. Und geschossen bereits in Tschechien, Tschechoslowakei. Und уже geschossen, dann gemacht das Schwung. Hat Tumor. Und das aber
Hello, are we back?
Okay, we are back with a fortune of questions. There were one or two people who had come forward to say, for those who don't understand Yiddish, what were people saying? I know that you had in your overview spoken about each of the people that you had filmed. Was there anything else that people said that you hadn't mentioned before?
Yes, as usual in making any anthology, we try to pull out a minute that's either instructive or entertaining. So the first lady, well, the lady in Smargon, that's the one sitting outside her wooden little chata, her wooden cabin, and then she's shown inside with her kitchen. When she's outside, a Russian neighbor is beckoning, is asking if he can come in, and she says in Russian, "Sakhadite, Sakhadite, come in, come in." And then she says to me, he's also quite a thief himself. So we have ironies like that. Then Meir Kistola, the partisan hero of Radin, in the first clip, he's standing near the grave of the Chofetz Chaim, who he remembered, of course, but from a distance. They didn't, of course, know him. He was a secular, not very religious boy, but everybody knew the famous rabbi. But in the second part of the clip, he tells this story. He says, "I am not going to dig my own grave. Yes, I will not dig my own grave. Either I kill him or he kills me." So I took my shovel, I hit him over the head, and I made it into the forest, because a human being is born to live and not be murdered by a fascist. So that was Meir Kistola of Radin. Then Liba Krenitsky or Krenichner of Mir basically is telling the story how her son won the bust of Lenin as a hockey medal, and how proud she is of it. It's a more lighthearted moment for her. Then the lady Beilich Dillon of Oshmene shows us the Sefer Torah, the scroll of Torah that she was able to rescue after the war. And it's a long, complicated story, but it was a complete Torah that helped the family enormously when time came. And there are many stories. Her two granddaughters finally emigrated to Israel, but her son-in-law wouldn't let them any years, so that was the family fight every year, whether they would be allowed to emigrate to Israel. And an amazing character. So each of these people spoke to us for 10, 12 hours. Again, much of this is preserved on audio, but it's a treasure of the last in situ Litvaks, whether they were religious, whether they were anti-religious, whether they were saved by the priest and baptized. In other words, a variety of people very different than what we think of as post-war Litvaks in Western and other countries. Okay. Perhaps this would be a moment just to say a few words about all these people. They're all gone now. And I would say that that part of the work ended around 6-7 years ago. Okay. So someone who was born in 1935 is way too young for me to be interested in them. Okay. That linguistically, culturally, they didn't come to any kind of maturity. I'm happy we were able to help many of these people, firstly by informing the Joint Distribution Committee of their existence, and the Joint was fantastic in seeking them out even in isolated villages in the 90s and getting aid to them. And then an important project in California was a spin-off. Some friends in California started the Survivor Mitzvah Project. All these projects help these people economically, but that generation is now gone. So I think that about my own interaction with them, when the Oxford program in Yiddish collapsed in 1996-97, I moved to a visiting professorship at Yale in 98-99. And my late mother, who passed away last year, never forgave me. That when Yale offered me 10 years, I said, no, I'm going to Vilna, because I had an offer there at 1/10 or whatever it was, 100, I don't remember anymore, the salary. And it was to be able to spend weekends and holidays continuing this work. And I'm so glad I did, because between 99 And around 2010, 2012, 2013, there were still people to find in this large Litvak area. Remember, it coincides with today's Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus. Belarus more than anywhere else. Belarus includes more than half of the old province of Vilna of the Tsarist times, and a lot of northeastern and eastern Ukraine, northeastern Poland, places like Suwałk and Seni, and even westernmost Russia, okay? Places like Lubavitch and Smolensk that are in Russia, not in Belarus, and traveling south all the way to Kherson on the Black Sea. So it's a big empire, and it was a nice irony that the only thing left of the old Lithuanian Grand Duchy on the ground was the Lithuanian Yiddish dialect that was all and only in these territories until recently. And now, very sadly, in the immediate past, and I am slowly digitizing and putting tapes up on YouTube. So there's already quite a few, but there'll hopefully be quite a few more. Someone after me will hopefully organize them all and all the rest.
Well, I think that you were very lucky, Dovid, and I think that you really got some golden nuggets.
Yes.
Because as you said, these people aren't here anymore. So if you hadn't conducted these interviews and made the effort to actually look for them, we would never have known their story.
Right.
But this is also, does this lead into your dictionary, the Yiddish dictionary that you are compiling, all of this, you know, the different dialects of Yiddish? Is that going into your dictionary?
I would like to say yes, but it's not exactly the case. The dictionary is the project I came up with to fill my time when there no longer were expeditions. The dictionary is English to Yiddish. It's Yiddish Cultural Dictionary.org, completely free online. The dictionary is to help advanced students of Yiddish by giving them a multiplicity of choices in Yiddish when thinking in English and wanting to think in Yiddish. Of course, I learned an enormous amount on the road that went into the dictionary in any case. And it was part of the thrill of the expeditions to become a student of Yiddish after being a teacher all those years and learning Yiddish from all these people. So the project that went into the expeditions is my atlas, which is frankly a little stalled at the moment, but 30 maps are up on the web, on my website under Atlas. The first 30 maps are up, and as soon as circumstances permit, I hope to get back down into all the questionnaires and tapes to do another 30 and so forth. So it's a slightly different emphasis, but it did teach me how different the real McCoy untouched before the war is from what we all thought and taught. There was one other connection. When I did move to Vilnius in 1999, and when I did move the summer course that had existed for decades from Oxford to Vilnius, I did have the following theory in mind, that as long as these people were alive and we could bring them into Yiddish education as living people, why on earth should we have a summer course in Oxford when we can have it in Vilnius? Now, because of the politics, that course doesn't exist, sadly, anymore. But the point I wanted to make here is that about 6-7 years ago, in any case, that wonderful juxtaposition was disappearing with the disappearance of that generation. Their children are what's impolitely called Homo Sovieticus, and nothing to blame them. They had no choice in Soviet times. They are Soviet people who do not have this cultural treasure passed on to them. By and large, there are always a few exceptions.
Okay, so Jonathan Penkin's got an interesting question for you. Could you tell us whether the classic South African Jewish food like kneedlach, tzimmus, teglach, is uniquely Jewish, or as some say, was typical Lithuanian or Eastern European food eaten by all parts of the local population?
Okay. It's a very controversial question that I touch with great trepidation as someone who is not a specialist on it. My personal opinion always was that they are extremely similar to the non-Jewish variants, especially in localities. But it often happened that a certain exact recipe stuck in a certain city from a certain tradition, from a certain shtetl, where part of the recipe evolved to something Jewish, plus all the laws of kashrus that also came in to doing kosher versions of all kinds of non-kosher foods. But I personally never saw any great new culinary tradition coming out of anything Jewish. I saw the East European Jewish tradition, part of the East European tradition with certain specificities, becoming the Jewish tradition in places like America, London, and South Africa, or Israel, etc., where they stood out.
Okay, great. Then Roger Noble says, Dovid, that was absolutely fascinating. Can you say something about other cultural things that correlated with the dialect groupings that you found?
Right. Some of the cultural non-linguistic differences, many of them have to do with details of the prayers and details of religious traditions, of the exact way candles are lit, of whether a certain word is included or not included in the blessings after the Haftorah on Sabbath mornings. So these things of little importance to outsiders were of very great importance to these places. Interesting, in older Jewish prayer books, you'll sometimes find notes about the tradition of, it says in the traditional Hebrew, Sholosh Medinos, 3 countries. What are the 3 countries? Lite, Zamet, Verais. In other words, Lithuania, Samogishia, Zamet, Žemaitija in the west, and Raisen in the east, which in prayer traditions could be very different from each other, not very, in our opinion, very in the opinion of the people who prayed it. So that's one example. Another important example from the modern point of view. These languages, Yiddish never existed in a vacuum as the only language. Yiddish never had an army and a navy as a state, although it became official in the Soviet Union and other places. It was only in addition to other languages. What I'm getting at, that the Yiddish of somewhere in the far west was co-territorial, as we call it, coincided, lived alongside the Lithuanian language and the German language, and less Russian and Polish. The further east you go, the more Russian and Polish, and then a little further east, Belarusian, or Belarusian as we call it, Belarusian language. There was a question, I think, a few weeks ago, it's only a few weeks ago, about the influence of the Lithuanian language on Lithuanian Yiddish, and my controversial reply was that outside of the area where Lithuanian itself was spoken, absolute zero. That in places like Vilna and Minsk and Pinsk and Vitebsk, zero. Only in the west where Lithuanian was the co-territorial language. So this meant that the Jews in the different parts of the Lithuanian territory were to some degree or other part of Lithuanian culture in the west, Polish in the middle, Belarusian in the east. And these made for very many differences in what they would study in local schools. And in between the wars, after World War I, and we had mentioned this briefly, but I think it's very relevant to this question, these people suddenly found themselves parts of different republics. Someone in Kovno, Kaunas was a Lithuanian citizen. Someone in Riga was a Latvian citizen. Someone in Vilna or Grodno was a Polish citizen. Someone in Minsk or in Vitebsk or in Gomel or in Mohilov was a Soviet citizen. Someone in Suwałk was a Polish citizen, and so on. In other words, the citizenships and the modern schools meant that there were more and more cultural differences coming in from which republic that part of traditional Lita ended.
It's not such a simple solution to the question. So Gary Salmo says, what is it in the Litvische psyche that whether they are religiously observant or not holds them to Orthodox synagogues and resistance to change?
Right. Perhaps I'll begin by answering with some facts before I come to the folklore. The facts are that when the modernizing movement, the Haskalah or the Haskola, came from Germany to Eastern Europe in the early 19th century, it completely failed to set up things like Reform Judaism or Conservative Judaism. So Litvaks never knew Reform or Conservative Judaism. They did know anti-religious Jewish culture, the modern movements of Hebrew and Yiddish of the 19th century that developed modern Hebrew and modern Yiddish literature, as we had discussed, I think 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, developed modern movements that were anti-religious, but as I said jokingly, but not so jokingly today, that was inherited to my generation after the war, that we were not Orthodox, but if you're going to go to shul, for God's sake, it has to be a real shul with a real rabbi. At least in my mind, I want it to be the way my great-grandmother and great-grandfather would have enjoyed shul, and not some modern, logical, scientific, politically correct, egalitarian enterprise. For that, I don't need shul. So the Litvak attitude was traditionally Orthodox or secular, okay, which to modern people can be very strange when American and South African and other tourists come to Lithuania and they find Jews who are not at all religious but have no patience for modern religion. This is that same phenomenon. So this is nothing against my many conservative and reform friends, okay? It is simply not in our culture. Secondly, as we discussed, the Litvak, of course, except for the Lithuanian Hasidim like Chabad, were very anti-Hasidic. And by comparison, that seemed rationalistic, especially as the Gaon of Vilna had encouraged the study of the sciences for the sake of understanding the Talmud better. But nevertheless, once you're studying geography and astronomy and all the other things, you're a much more educated person. Now we're coming into the folklore. That the Litvak loved knowledge, was very educated, but the folklore is that the Litvak always was more skeptical and questioning than the Southerners, which became the Hasidim after the 8th century. So in Litvak lore, that is why the Hasidim say about the Litvaks, Litvak hotat Salem and Kop. He has a cross in his brain. Okay, that is something there that is open to all sorts of modern things. That is also part of the image of it.
Okay, so we have a question here from David Israch or Dovid Katz. What region is the origin of the black silk jacket and cord worn by Lubavitch of Brooklyn, for example, and numerous other sects? Are there differences?
What, the difference between Lubavitch and others, or between Lubavitch and non-Lubavitch Litvaks? I didn't get it.
Well, I think it's the Lubavitches and other sects.
And other sects of Hasidism. Yes, there are subtle sartorial differences. I am not the person, I am not in any way a specialist. But I do know that when a Litvak rabbi and a Lubavitcher rabbi and a Satmar rabbi look at each other, they all, each of the three knows who the other two are. If you look at I will make a general comment that perhaps shows my ignorance of the topic, but it's impressionistic. If you look at a traditional Lubavitcher, I'm talking about the man now because he's dressed in the traditional regalia. He looks like something in between the traditional Litvak and what we Litvaks call the real Hasidim down south, the Gerer, the Satmar, the Bobover, etc. So Hasidim in Ukraine and Poland used to call Chabadnikas, Lubavitcher, Litvaks, because to them they looked more similar. For example, Lubavitcher often had short payas, side locks, and occasionally worn behind the ears, not braided all the way down the way the southern Hasidim. So there are certainly many differences in appearances, at least of the male, of the species.
Okay, so we have a question from Smedar Levi. Can you please tell us, if possible, about these people's feelings as they returned to Lithuania after the Holocaust, actually to the belly of the beast? How did they handle their post-trauma, their relationships with Goyim neighbors, trying to track their family members who were murdered, immigrated to South Africa, Israel, US, other diasporic communities of Litvaks? Thank you.
Well, that's way too much for me to be able to try to cope with now. I'll answer perhaps just one part of it. The people you saw today on the slides, in the PowerPoint, and on the brief video, what would they have said? Now, the people you saw today happen to have become my close friends over the 90s until the end of their lives, so I feel I can speak with some kind of personal power of representation. They were almost all of them were saved, as I had mentioned, by fleeing eastward to the Soviet. When they came back in 44, 45, 46, 47, whatever, they were often shocked to find that absolutely nobody survived. Many of them thought there'd be one relative, there'd be two, there'd be someone, and they understood the gravity of the genocide, that it was ended. Now, because they were returning to the Soviet Union that had defeated Hitler, they did not feel they're returning to the beast. They felt they're returning to the lands from which the fascists had been kicked out and defeated. And then we come to the much more sensitive part of how did they feel about their immediate neighbors. In the case of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Western Ukraine, they usually did not feel comfortable enough to continue living in the state because they knew about the massive local collaboration. So if they decided to stay in the area of their birth, it was in one of the cities. In the case of Lithuania, in the vast majority of cases, post-war, Vilnius. That's how Vilnius ended up with 16,000 Jews a few years after the war. Very few of them were Vilna Jews, but almost all of them were Litvaks. They didn't want to live in the shtetl. Many of the people I found in the shtetl, and some exemplars are those you saw today, were indeed in Belarus, where they felt much better, frankly, with their neighbors, because their neighbors were part of the Russian-speaking peoples, as they saw it, who had defended them against Hitler. They didn't have the incredible tales of betrayal of neighbors that you had in the book. So that depended when and where. Something in common, all these people, they wanted to stay. Not everybody went to the extent of dear Shifra Sverdlov in Disna, who hanged herself rather than go to Israel because she wanted to be buried with her mother. But her sentiment is one that I encountered very often. What? You think I'm going to leave my parents' grave? and moved to Israel or America or something. Never. So they were a certain type. Remember that I started in 1990, and many people were then emigrating en masse to Israel and elsewhere. And so these people I kept up with are those who didn't want to leave.
Okay, so just a reminder to our audience that if anybody would like to ask a question directly to Dovid, to put up your hand. Dimitri will then open up your camera and your audio, and so you can ask. So don't feel shy, please ask. But Gary Selma, in the meantime, was there a difference in the Yiddish spoken in Mir versus Ponevezh versus Zaimel?
Right, the first was Mir, and the second Ponevezh.
Ponevezh, and the third is Zaimel.
You mean the shtetl Zaimel?
I think so.
Right. Okay. Well, Mir would have been quite different from the other two because it's a lot further east. So Mir would have had Belarusian and Polish as its co-territorial language, not Lithuanian as in Ponevezh. And in general, it would have been that more easterly Litvish dialect. I mentioned the word ear. It would have been ever in Mir and Eva or Eya in Ponevezh. And there are many small differences like that are not so important to us today. But when a native speaker of one encountered the other, the first reaction is, what kind of a Litvak are you? Because each thought that, that their form is absolutely standard. So the differences are there, a little bit in sounds, a little bit in vocabulary, a little bit in meanings. They are sub-dialects of Northeastern Yiddish.
Okay, then Julia writes from St. Petersburg. She says, please tell about Tout Uncle.
About?
Tout Uncle.
Don't understand.
T-O-U-T. T-O-U-T. Maybe she's meaning your uncle.
My uncle. Well, I had several exciting uncles. And there have been books written about one of them, but I can't imagine anything very tied up with our
Okay,
topic.
so Martin Davis also comes and he says, why was great uncle kicked out of the shtetl?
Ah, okay. My great uncle Bentke Guberski, my father's uncle, he had been the village prankster in Michalish. Now, those of you who study Yiddish literature may know what shtetl pranksters did. They, for example, when the Rebbe, who was with them 10 hours or 12 hours a day, fell asleep, a prankster might glue his outer garment to the chair, or even worse, might glue his beard to the table. Other pranksters did things that would make strange sounds and so on. But my great uncle Benke, after doing all those things, did something much worse. When the local builder, Feivel der Muller, the bricklayer or the waterman Muller, when Feivel der Muller was on his deathbed and saying all kinds of intimate farewells to his wife, Benke, then a boy of probably about 12 or 13, around his bar mitzvah, who was a genius at accents and mimicking, mastered Feivel's voice. 3 days after Feivel died, Benke dressed up in a white sheet and knocked on the door, and he told his wife, why did you bury me? I'm alive, and in the white sheet. The wife became hysterical, running through the shtetl in her nightgown, so the story goes, yelling, "Ashed, Ashed, Ashed, a ghost, a ghost, a ghost." The whole shtetl was awakened. When it came to the rabbi, he quickly figured it out, that it's Benke Aaron Velvels. Benke, the son of Aaron Velvel-Buberski, who at that time, whatever that was, 1900, 1901, we don't know, was doing very well with his lumber business. And that same day, the story in our family goes, his father, Aaron Velvel, said, Ich schicke in Amerika. Soll Amerika von dem Leiden nicht mechalisch. May America suffer, let America suffer from him, not mechalishik. And he sent him to a very distant relative who had already settled in New Haven, Connecticut, years before that. It was thanks to Benke's migration that my father and his siblings and their mother, etc., eventually emigrated. One would go to the other, to the third. You might wonder what Benke's fate was in America. He became the champion card player and gambler of the city of Clifton, New Jersey, and his wedding gift to my parents, who were married in the summer of 1950, or 70 years ago, was at the radio that he had won from the police chief of Clifton, New Jersey, in a card game. And a radio in those days was a huge piece of furniture with sliding doors. So in our home in Brooklyn, my parents had the radio taken out and it became the bar to keep the l'chaims for guests. To serve it, we would always say this was the wedding present from Benke. So long after all the other wedding presents were forgotten. Now, Benke, I only met him in his 80s during a visit to Clifton. He had a wealth of Yiddish folklore, of not quite underworld, but of the card-playing classes in Yiddish. So my father collected it, and it's all on the internet in my late father's collection of Yiddish folk songs. So under dovidkatz.net, if you go to Menke Katz, and then you go to folk songs, there's a whole section, my uncle Benke's card-playing games, songs rather. And there's a bit of off-color Yiddish there, so if you're delicate of nature, stay away.
Well, l'chaim to Benke.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got two people who would like to ask questions. If I could ask, it's either E. Silber, there we are, to ask his question.
Guten Tag, Dovid.
Guten.
I have a question. Ich rede Yiddish, aber I have a question, and I'll tell you in English. The use of other languages in Yiddish. For example, my grandparents migrated from Grodno, which is now Belarus, to Kovno, and my parents grew up in Kovno, and they used a lot of Russian in their Yiddish. For example, konche essen, you know, finish eating, or oya maladietz. How much is that accepted in Yiddish parlance, or is it just a particular family, a sign of a particular family?
Right. Well, I don't think there are any two Yiddishists that'll give you the same answer, but I'm happy to give you mine. Maladiet in Yiddish became part of all forms of literary Yiddish, and it's a perfectly good word in Yiddish. So when you say in Yiddish, oh yeah, maladiet, it's like saying in English, well done, even though maladiet is a noun, and it meant originally the young man in the circus or whatever who could pull off amazing things. In Yiddish, if you're really, really happy with what someone has done or pulled off amazingly, and you want to give them a real emotional, hearty compliment, bist a maladiet. You are a maladiet. Okay, so that became Yiddish. It's a Yiddish word that comes from Russian. Just as there are English words that come from somewhere, but people in English are not accustomed to constantly think about that, and people in Yiddish who know where it comes from often think of the origin of the etymology. The second example you gave, konchen, instead of endiken, to finish, that is considered a Russianism that people picked up, for example, very often if they went to a Russian school between the wars, if they were in evacuation with Russian-speaking Jews during the war, or just a family idiosyncrasy where it's stuck from Russian. So there are forms of Yiddish, especially in the East. If we're talking about the Litvak area, it really wouldn't be in Grodno, but further east, in Vitebsk and so on, where Konchin was regularly used, but only for finishing a certain grade in school. Had gekonchet 7 class. Okay, they finished 7 classes. So I don't think it's native Grodno Yiddish or Kovno Yiddish, but because of the Russian Empire, even long after the empire disappeared and Grodno became part of Poland at the end of the First World War, and Kovno became part of Lithuania, that Russianism stuck, and the Russian language continued to be well known to the old generation.
Right, thank you for a very good question. We now have Neville. Neville, if you can, there we are. Neville has a question for you.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Mine is kind of the opposite question, and that's about how Yiddish might have influenced the local languages. In other words, whether Yiddish was genuinely exclusively spoken by Jews, and those people in the video that you showed, they were speaking Yiddish, I take it, perhaps various dialects of Yiddish. Was Yiddish spoken, was it the only language, or would they have spoken local languages, like whatever the local language might have been, like Polish or Russian as well? Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Excellent point. Every Yiddish speaker was multilingual, very rarely bilingual, usually 3 languages or more. So somebody growing up in Grodno in the 1920s, besides Yiddish, would have known forms of Russian and forms of Polish for everyday to the non-Jewish neighbors. At the same time, very many non-Jews in a shtetl spoke Yiddish. We were able to document that phenomenon only until about 2002, 2003 was the last person we found, Christians who really speak Yiddish, not just a few words. So in a typical shtetl, whether the co-territorial was more Baltic, Lithuanian, or more Slavic, Belarusian, Russian, everybody spoke all these languages well enough to speak to the others. It was a multilingual environment. There was no monolingualism.
Tell you, Dovid, we could be sitting here until 2 o'clock tomorrow morning. There's so much activity, but I think we'll take one more video question. And if you don't mind, I'm going to send you a copy of all of the questions that we haven't asked you.
Okay.
And maybe we can include those for next week.
Absolutely.
So, Pamela.
Shalom Aleichem, Dovid. It's Perelka. You added the K to my name in a course that I did with you through the Arbiter Ring last year. I was privileged to study with Dovid for 6 weeks. My question today, Dovid, is would you consider doing a course or making a CD or something on the real Litvischer accent? I mean, I don't know about the good Sabbastiker. My Boba was a good Sabbastiker Yid. I still remember saying a good Sabbas. But just so that, because today with the Klaussprach, and I'm doing so many summer courses at the moment, that everything is cloud, we are losing we've lost our authenticity, and it is gone. But is there any way that you, as the world expert, could perhaps run a course or make some sort of teaching instrument so that those of us who still want to speak like our Borbas and Zaydas can do it?
Right. I'm personally not the CD making type. I'm a little of the too old generation, but I would certainly consider a living course, a language course where we interact. But before myself, I would like to mention a few things people could do if they want to learn to speak Litvish Yiddish. First, There are very many hours of tape on the internet available for free, way beyond my own YouTube channel that, as I said, I keep hoping to add to as I digitize more and more. For example, two famous American rabbis, Pinchas Teitz and Moshe Feinstein. Of course, for religious Jews, they are giants of Torah, and for that reason, there is a group of students who have to learn Litvish Yiddish to enjoy their shiurim. So if you listen, Pinchas Teitz is much easier. I would start with him and then go to Moshe Feinstein. And then the great secret for Litvaks is that Chabad Yiddish is Eastern Litvish, and indeed it's a deep Litvish dialect itself. So all the sichos of the late Rebbe that are in Yiddish are in Litvish Yiddish, except when he got very, very tired, something would slip in from his native Nikolaev Yiddish. He was born in Ukraine and later when he studied in the real Chabad Yeshiva. Okay. Beyond that, there are today a few Orthodox groups that speak a beautiful Litvish Yiddish. In Israel, there are parts of the Brisker. There are parts of the old Yishuv, the ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem. And in my work on my dictionary, and indeed on Litvish Yiddish, I have been helped enormously by a brilliant young Haredi Jew who became, perhaps he's now the world expert on Litvish Yiddish, Jonathan Fellendler. The original name is Fellhendler, but the hay fell out, so Fellendler. Jonathan Fellendler, who lives in Kiryat Sefer, not far from Jerusalem, he has listened, and I was going to come to this resource now, to the tapes of Uriel Weinrach's Language and Culture Atlas of Ashkenazi Jewry that was completely audio, no video. Thanks to the people who took it over, Ulrike Kiefer and others in Germany, it's all available on the internet. So when Jonathan Fellendler has some free time, he listens to 10, 12 hours of the informant from Shklov, the informant from Malak, the informant from Kovna, from the Atlas, and can hear hours and hours and hours of Litvish Yiddish from 40 or 50 years ago. That is frankly going to be better than anything any of us can produce today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Wow, I tell you, we have had another wonderful, wonderful evening. And thank you so much for your time. I know I refer to you as the walking encyclopedia. It just amazes me that you are able to sit for this length of time without looking at a single script to be able to talk. You really are passionate. You are enthused about the subject. And we can see you love it. So all much. I can say is a grazen Dank. Sei gesund.
Seid alle gesund und mit sich sehen über 8 Tage Dienstag. Gute, glückliche, gesunde Woche.
Well, until next week, we are going to send you lots of questions that have come up. I'm very sorry that Sorrel Kerbel, who put up her hand, we haven't been able to ask her question.
Next week,
but we will send it to you, and next week you can have a look. And please, God, you can start answering the questions we couldn't do this week. Thank you so much, Dovid, and thanks all for joining us tonight.
Good night.
Sei gesund.